Before I start, I must apologize for the drilling you might hear in the background. There's some renovation works going on outside of my building, just the joys of remote working, but should hopefully be kept to a minimum. I'm Zoe Tabry. I'm the Land and Property Rights Editor at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, which is the charitable arm of Thomson Reuters, and I'm delighted to be your host today. Today, we're going to be talking about the coronavirus pandemic, biodiversity, and climate change, and how Indigenous people can define the path forward on those issues. Indigenous people and local communities manage more than half of the world's land, and these biodiverse ancestral lands are vital to the people who steward them and to the planet we share. But governments only recognize Indigenous and community ownership of about 10% of the world's lands. Research by the IPCC and others has showed that security of tenure is a highly efficient and cost-effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions caused by deforestation, particularly in forests managed by Indigenous people. In countries that provide stronger legal rights to Indigenous communities to own and manage forests, there's an overwhelmingly positive correlation with reduction of land degradation and the stabilizing of forest landscapes. Yet more than 26 million hectares of forest are still being cut down every year. And environmental degradation from deforestation, environmental pollution, contamination of rivers and whatnot have all had a negative impact on Indigenous communities. This webinar today will explore the resilience of Indigenous people and their ability to tackle climate change based upon their local knowledge. It will explore direct actions being taken by Indigenous communities to defend their territories and against those who seek to profit either from the coronavirus pandemic or to undermine their efforts. I'm joined by a terrific panel to discuss those issues today. I'll hand over to each one of them for some opening remarks. We'll then have a discussion for about an hour and finally take questions from you, the audience, which should take us just about 90 minutes. If you do have a question, please would you post it using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so not the chat box feature. And I'll then field those to the panelists so that we don't have to go through the all too familiar pains of people muting and unmuting themselves. Please do feel free to tweet as well using hashtag IPLC COVID-19, and the Land Portal team will be live tweeting from their account. Finally, in the interest of transparency, I should add that today's session is being recorded and you will all receive a link to the video afterwards, as well as an invitation to take part in a very short survey, which should take no more than 2 minutes, where we'd love to hear your thoughts on how this panel went. I'm now going to introduce each one of our panel and ask them to talk about their experiences. First, I'm delighted to welcome Carlos Zambrana Torello, who's the Associate Vice President for Conservation and Health at EcoHealth Alliance. Carlos works on the intersection between animal and human health, and he's particularly interested in biological diversity, from viruses to ecosystems respond to anthropogenic gradients. Originally from Bolivia, Carlos has worked in different tropical forests around the world, and in another life, he worked with the Tacana people, an indigenous community in Bolivia, mapping the use and management of natural resources. Carlos, thank you so much for joining. And to set the scene a little bit, could you talk us through how humanity and more broadly the planet stand to benefit from preserving land, be it in terms of preventing deforestation, mitigating climate change, etc.?
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here and then great to discuss with fantastic people in this panel. Well, thank you. As we are living through another pandemic in human history, we are start thinking about our relationship with nature. So, there are a few things that I want to mention that are really important. One is the emerging infection diseases that are related to COVID-19, for example. All of them have, most of these diseases have an animal origin. And the reason that we are getting these diseases is because we are also animals. We are part of that kingdom. We are part of that group of animals. So we have evolutionary. We have an evolution similarity with animals. So that's why we can share these diseases. And the reason that we are sharing more and the diseases and we're getting more of these impacts in the world is because we are entering this forest, we are getting more in contact with animals, with wildlife. So in the case, for example, of the COVID-19, there's been some discussions about the SARS coronavirus 2 had came through the wildlife trade market or through directly transmission from bats. But the reality is that we don't know for sure. We are still working, we are still learning, we are still have too much ground to cover in terms of where the exact transmission pathway. What we can say in general is that deforestation, land use change, it's one of the major driver, or it's the most important driver of the past emerging infection diseases. And this land use change is related to agricultural intensification, and we have interesting examples of that in, for example, in Southeast Asia with Nipah virus that emerged from bats, and then it jumped into pigs, and from there to humans. We have examples from similar examples from Lassa fever, for example, in Africa, or for example, Ebola outbreaks in Africa, or the HIV that originally emerged from non-human primates into humans many years ago. Examples in Latin America include several different hemorrhagic fevers, hantaviruses, or Machupo virus in my home country in Bolivia that emerged because agricultural intensification is happening, sugarcane plantations are expanding, and people getting more in contact with wildlife. So, what is the role of indigenous peoples on this? Is extremely relevant in preserving and mitigating these impacts. Really, a few numbers that are, something very important to remember is that indigenous people land cover close to 1/4 of the terrestrial land in our planet. So think about it, it's close to 25% of the terrestrial land. It is related to, it's indigenous people land. So there's a lot of potentiality for preserving, for mitigating the impacts of diseases, or to prevent, mitigate the impacts of climate change. Within this big area, most of the land, around 35% of that land, has what we call intact forest. So the forest is well preserved, well conserved. It's beautiful forest. It's similar to over here, this way over here. It's a nice forest, and then it's well managed. It is there, even though there are people living there, they have some balance, and the way they are using it's sustainable use within that land. So that it's important to remember those numbers. It's very well conserved, and that that fact it helps us to avoid climate change, and a few things, like for example, mitigate climate change, and things that we don't really think about, like for example, reduces the temperature in that area, local temperature. It's cooler in the forest. If you go outside, if you go on that the other side here, that's on a plantation, and it's extremely hot outside. So simple things like that, it changed completely how people are relating, are doing their work in their landscape, and how people get, they don't get sick, right? Like you can get other health problems by being too hot or too warm in some areas, and that also is related to land, indigenous people land is also related to preventing deforestation. The rates of deforestation in indigenous lands are lower compared to other places. But the problem is that the borders are getting increased impacts of deforestation, and this is because it's just people or other land use plans, land use management is happening on the borders, and that's why it's one of the biggest problems. Those borders are important. Something I want to mention relates the maintenance of human health as another service that, or as another contribution from indigenous people land to humanity. And this concept, this idea of maintenance of human health, it's something that we at Eco Health Alliance are promoting, and we are trying to show evidence that really is helping us to reduce, to prevent pandemics. In our, there's no or less contact between humans and animals. It just reduces the chances of spillover of pandemic risk. But more importantly, indigenous people living in those areas have deeper knowledge about the risks on how to interact with animals. They even have they know which species to target for hunting, for example. And then I discussed this a couple of days ago. For example, in South America, there is no bad consumption for meat as compared to other parts in the world. So that it's reducing the risk really of pandemics. But also importantly, indigenous people know how to prepare the recipes, how to prepare the food, and that it's extremely important and in the transmission and in how people get infected with viruses or other pathogens. Which leads me to the next point, and my last point I want to make here is that indigenous people lands are also securing our food diversity, and then they are pretty much archives for the future. Right now, humanity depends on a handful of crops. We depend on rice, potatoes, corn, soybeans, and in many cases, those are not even to feed ourselves. Those are to feed domestic animals. So we depend, and we are reducing the diversity of food. Whereas in the diversity of food, and more importantly, how to prepare this food is being preserved by indigenous local people, by those communities. That in the future we are going, I can assure you, we are going back to there and trying to recover that information for our sake. Despite all these benefits, we are still have big problems. Indigenous people land are still vulnerable. And one example I want to make is fires in the Amazon right now, or in Africa, or elsewhere. The Amazon basin, it's on fire, and there's been like extremely intensive fires since last year, and are all related to the type of government that we have in the region, but also is related to the demand of meat elsewhere in the world. And most of the fires are happening outside in indigenous communities' land or indigenous people land, but the haze is entering those areas. The haze they doesn't respect borders, and people are getting sick, and they are suffering from that.
Thanks so much, Carlos. Really a lot to unpack there, but I note from what you said the role that kind of forests play in helping mitigate climate change, in protecting human health, but also in improving food diversity. And we'll certainly come back to some of those later on in the discussion. I'm also interested in what you said on the role of the extent to which the pandemic has exacerbated these threats. So we'll come back to that as well. I must now just apologize on behalf of Calixto Ribeiro, who was supposed to join us today, but who is in the field at the moment and was struggling to get an internet connection. So we'll see if we can patch him in at some point throughout the discussion. But if not, I will just skip on straight to our next panelist, who is David Kaimovitz, who serves as Senior Advisor for the Climate and Land Use Alliance. He's previously led the Ford Foundation's Natural Resources and Climate Change Program and served as a member on Clueless Board. David has a PhD in agricultural economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has written or co-written 7 books and published more than 100 scientific publications. David, thank you so much for joining. I know you're currently completing. Hi, I know you're currently completing a study about indigenous territories in Latin America. And could you talk us through a little bit the main findings, particularly in terms of how well the forests have been managed to date, and also why?
Yeah, hello to everybody, and thanks for the invitation to join you in this webinar. Certainly a very important topic. I've been doing some research for about 6 or 8 months now for FAO and FELAC, looking at the indigenous territories in Latin America in particular. Those territories together have over 300 million hectares of forests. So that's a forest about 3 times the size of Bolivia, about 6 times the size of all of Central America, a huge amount of forest. And that forest is incredibly important, obviously, for the people who live there. There's somewhere between 3 and 7 million indigenous people who live in these forests, and then a couple of million additional Afro-descendant peoples who also live in similar situations in the forests in Latin America. And these forests right now have about 14%. That's more than 1/8 of all of the carbon in the tropical forests of the world. That's more carbon than all of Indonesia, more carbon than all of the Democratic Republic of Congo, enough carbon that if these indigenous peoples' forests are not protected and not supported, it could have significant impacts not only on the regional climate, but on the global climate and global warming. From a biodiversity perspective, you've got a situation where the indigenous territories of Brazil have more vertebrates, more mammals, amphibians, reptiles, birds than all of the other protected areas in Brazil. So absolutely fundamental for biodiversity in the Brazilian Amazon, the same in the Bolivian Amazon that Carlos was talking about. So these forests are incredibly important from a livelihood perspective for the people who live there, but also for the global climate, for the global biodiversity, and for regional hydrological flows. Huge amounts of water going into the air coming down in other areas as rain. And traditionally, these forests have been much, much better protected than other forests in Latin America. Deforestation rates are much lower, forest degradation rates are much lower in these indigenous and Afro-descendant forests. And that's for a handful of different reasons. One reason you often hear about is the cultural reasons, the indigenous people's culture being more similar, more in tune with nature, with greater traditional knowledge of the forest and how to manage it. A lot has to do with certain just cultural values and practices, if you will. The largest sources of deforestation in Latin America today are cattle ranching, extensive cattle ranching, and mechanized agriculture, mechanized soybean agriculture, mechanized corn agriculture. Indigenous peoples are not particularly involved in either of those. So that's a big difference from a cultural perspective. Another major reason why these forests have been better protected than other forests is because there have been a series of government policies that have been supportive of these policies being protected up until now. Latin America has moved much faster than Africa or Asia in recognizing indigenous peoples' territorial rights and land tenure. There have been more programs to support payments for environmental services, to provide support for helping them to maintain their forests, a more proactive support from governments for community forest management. And many of these indigenous territories also are simultaneously protected areas. So that gives them an additional element of protection. And then finally, there's a series of more geographical reasons why these indigenous territories have been much better protected than other forests. They tend to be less accessible, more remote. They tend to have soils that are not particularly good for intensive agriculture. So all of these come together, and that means that indigenous peoples have been playing a very important role in Latin America, protecting the forest, not only for themselves, as guardians of the forest, not only for themselves, but also for the world, to help stabilize the global climate, help maintain the biodiversity that the entire planet depends on. The terrible thing is that this situation is changing, that the threats against these forests are increasing very rapidly, that there's roads being put into these areas, that there's governments that used to be supporting territorial rights that are less supportive today than they used to be, that there's declining budgets for community forestry and declining budgets for payments for environmental services, And that there's very rapidly growing demands for agricultural commodities, mineral commodities, petroleum. All of these things are putting a lot of pressure on these forests. So forests that have traditionally been protected, we can't assume will continue to be protected in the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David. Really helpful regional perspective there, and a lot of interesting points I think you make on the possible impact of deforestation on the regional and global climate, on the huge loss of biodiversity, and of course the contribution it makes to so many people's livelihoods. And I think the term guardian that you've used, guardians of the forest, really is the right one here. So that these custodians of this hugely valuable resource. So something we'll come back to as well throughout the discussion. Now I'd like to come to Hindu Umaru Ibrahim, who is an environmental activist and a member of Chad's pastoralist Mbororo community. Hindu began advocating for indigenous rights and environmental protection at the age of 16, founding the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad to introduce new income revenue activities for women and collaborative tools such as 3D participatory mapping to build sustainable ecosystems management and reduction of nature-based conflicts. Her vision is to grow support for both traditional knowledge and science to improve the resilience to climate change, especially for rural communities. Hindu, thank you so much for joining. You've started advocating for Indigenous rights and environmental protection when you were only 16. Could you tell us what prompted you to start working on those issues? And then could you also tell us a bit more about how Indigenous people in the Sahel region are coping with the climate crisis?
Thank you very much, Zoe, and hi, everybody. It's really a great pleasure to be with David and Carlos in this panel. As you said, I started like officially advocating on the age of 16, where I created the Indigenous Women and Peoples Association of Chad. But I started my fight since I was kids, because I'm coming from indigenous communities. I'm coming from Mbororo pastoralist peoples who are nomadic and living across the Sahel. So we do not depend from the colonization, border of the countries, but we depend from the landscape where we are living. So that's why my communities are from Chad, Cameroon, Niger, Nigeria, and Central African Republic. And this is also the unique for indigenous peoples around all the world. We do not just depend from where they are cutting, where is the border, but we depend from the ecosystem where we are living from. So I started my fight since I was young, because when you are coming from an indigenous communities, you are coming, of course, from the rural areas. You have your behavior where you are depending and attached from the nature. And then the other kids who are from the city look at us differently. So this is the starting of understanding of marginalization of indigenous peoples and indigenous kids. So from that age, I was kids, I didn't understood what's going on. But when I started growing up a little bit, that's I say no, I got lucky to understand why I am getting marginalized. How about the other kids at the community level who do not get this chance? So I need to create something to protect the rights of the girls and of the kids. But immediately I understood I cannot talk about the human rights without talking about the environment right, because we depend from it. My people depend from the rainfall. We depend from the season. If there is pastures, if there is water, if our land are safe, fertile, and if there is not, so our rights are completely violated. So for me, from the beginning, I can't talk about human rights as is peace, and without talking about environment right as our ecosystem where we can depend on it. So that's put me to create the organization, because of course we need an institutions where we can draw up the ideas that we do have. So maybe I can say I'm lucky to get the chance to go to school, but it is not the case of all the indigenous communities in Chad. And when I say Chad, maybe also in Africa and in many other communities. As David and Carlos also said, we are living on the very remote areas. And then as we know, the development are excluding many indigenous communities. And in the Sahel in particular, peoples, you have more than 80% that depending from the agriculture, pastoralist, or fishery. They do not depend from the end of the month salaries. And among these communities, you have indigenous peoples who are again doubly marginalized and doubly depending from the natural resources. And that's why also when I come back to the topic of the discussions, indigenous peoples in the COVID, so that make us also in front line of the pandemic, the most vulnerable to the pandemic. And there is two reasons of it. Because firstly, in the Sahel regions, we are really the front line of the climate change. We're already vulnerable vis-a-vis to this crisis. The environmental degradation, it's really very, very high. And when it's come to the COVID, so it's found us already vulnerable and we do not get access to any health care. And then the information that given across all the country, I can say all the world, are only adapted to the peoples who get access to the information in the major languages. So when you don't have information on the pandemic, you cannot apply all the rules that establish our social distances or wearing the mask or whatever. So the consequence for us, it is not only the pandemic that the peoples can contact, but the consequence of the COVID, who is the food security, who is the conflict among communities. Because when they close the borders, when they close the market, we depend from the exchanging of the products during the market. So no one can get access to exchange his product. And then the food insecurities start being very critical in the communities level. And when they close the borders, while we are transboundary nomadic communities, so you can move to your ecosystem. And the rain season, you cannot stop it. So the season cannot be stopped because we do have COVID. And of course, we cannot also wear the mask and protect ourselves from the climate. So when we don't have all this control on the nature and on the what is happening, so we become most vulnerable. And confirmations, the World Food Organization yesterday published a report, and in the map, suddenly my country, Chad, is the most vulnerable on the food insecurity around all African countries, but around all the world. We are the only one in the middle of Africa who have the red colors, and it's like increasing by -25% of the food insecurity. So for me, it's obvious because we are from line of the climate change, because we do have the natural resources that's shrinking. And because we are landlocked, we do not get access to any other services. And because COVID-19 is impacting us and limiting us to get access outside. So from my communities as indigenous peoples, it's growing up to the entire populations. And I'm so worried about what is happening and what will be happen on the next coming years, because we are the most vulnerable on all what is happening now. So that's, I mean, it's my daily fight, and for my peoples, and also for the Sahel, and without forgetting the connection between indigenous peoples across the world. Because when we are advocating, I can advocate, even we are the most vulnerable, I can advocate only for my people as Mbororo without advocating for indigenous peoples in Amazon or in Asia or in the Arctic or in North America or Pacific, because we are all depending from the nature. We are all the guardian of the nature. We are protecting it. If you have fire in Amazon, the consequence going to be even in Chad, even in Asia. If you have the dramatic drought in Chad, the consequence going to be in Europe, in Arctic, in whatever. So maybe we are far away living, but we are interconnected by the reaction of our planet and of our ecosystem, because we have only the one air we are breathing, all depending on it. And we have also the source of the water everywhere and everyone that depend on it. And we have also the fertile land who produce the food for the entire planet. You can be indigenous or non-indigenous. So if one of it is harmed, the other absolutely getting harmed. So that's why my fight is for my people's first beings, of course, for my region Sahel, but for the entire communities that is depend from the resources of the planet.
Thank you so much, Indu. I mean, I think the work you do is so inspiring, but also you've provided a very sobering, but I think much needed look at what life is for a community on the front line of climate change, and how climate change and land degradation, etc., can threaten an entire way of life, for example, for pastoralist communities. I was just a couple of years ago in Mauritania reporting on actually mostly women pastoralists who were telling me that climate change and kind of ever longer periods of drought were forcing kind of herders and pastoralists to travel ever long distances for their food, and kind of changing transhumance from just a month or a couple of months to 8-month long periods, and how, as you rightly say, that threatens an entire way of life. So thank you so much for those comments. A lot of what you said that I want to come back to as well. How the entire livelihood depends on the ecosystem, but also what you raised about access to health in times of COVID. For people who have, I see people keep kind of joining us, which is great. And I see that all three of our panelists' comments have really resonated with the audience as well. If I could just remind those of you who have just joined and who have questions, if you could please post them on the Q&A button at the top of your screen, and we'll then fill those to the panelists. We also encourage everyone to tweet using hashtag IPLC COVID-19, or follow the Land Portal Twitter account. We'll be live tweeting the entire session. And you'll also have a link to the on-demand video after this panel, so you can refer back to it if you've missed any points. For now, we have about 30 minutes or so discussion with a panel, and I'll then be moving to questions from you all. Before I go on to solutions, because I do want to focus the kind of bulk of the webinar on this, I did have one question I wanted to address to our panel, and some of you have touched on this already. But I wanted to ask all three of you how you felt, or to what extent you felt, that the coronavirus pandemic has exacerbated existing dangers to Indigenous people and their land. How worse has it kind of made the situation in recent months? Whoever would like to go first, David, Carlos, or Hindu. Yeah, go ahead.
David.
Carlos?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Oh, yeah, no, COVID-19 has affected, well, in different ways the world, but the biggest problem, the biggest threat is to people that are living in, for example, indigenous communities that are in remote areas where the access to health is so difficult to get. And again, my experiences from living in Bolivia and working in some of these areas. In some cases, people have to walk 2 days or 1 day to get to the nearest health facility to get some medicine or some medical attention. On one hand, that limits the contact with other people infected, right? But reduce the risk. But once the COVID-19 is detected or it's affecting that area, or that community, it becomes a big problem, and it becomes and then the way people are sharing, it's not, like we can do on the cities, like everybody's isolated, everybody's collaborating, everybody's working together, and everybody depends on the work of each other in the indigenous communities. You cannot really isolate, you cannot quarantine people, so it becomes a public health problem. One of the things that really worries me about is in the future, and I've been thinking a lot about once the vaccine is developed and started the distribution of the vaccine, who are going to be the people who are going to get the vaccine? It's going to be people in these areas, really remote areas, or people with not really immediate access to health or to medical facilities. So And that is one of the biggest problems. So how are we going to be dealing with that? It's people that are less resource, don't have economic resources available immediately, and they will receive the less medical information or the medical, health care that it's need to prevent this. So that's what it's. I'm worried about the future, and I'm worried about how once an outbreak starts in one of these communities, remote communities, how we are going to respond. We are failing in the cities. I live in New York, and New York managed relatively well, but other parts in the US, it's a big problem. So how we are going to manage that in those areas, it's important. So in this case, and a little bit going ahead for our discussion, we need to discuss more about information. We need to be very open on how we can meet these problems. And then the best way in this moment is to talk about and then inform people of what's going on the ground.
Thank you so much. Yes, Hindu, I know you made some similar points on this and the kind of challenges of the sheer challenge of accessing health, which, as Carlos say, is a massive enough challenge in cities. So never mind kind of more remote areas with much harder access to infrastructure and other things. Hindu, could you give us some examples of how that struggle has played out at the local level during the pandemic, for example, in accessing healthcare?
Sure. I mean, it was very hard time. I mean, it's still because firstly, as I said, access to the information is the measure to understand what is happening. Because when they took the measure, COVID came overnight. So it was not something planned that we are prepared. And all the information was just given by the government. In my country, every single day you have like 5 to 10 decisions coming from different ministries from the presidency that say like different measures that people have to take. And so for the peoples who do not went to school, who are illiterate in the town, it's already a problem for them. And when you go to the remote area where they do not have radio, they do not have TV, so they cannot get access to this information at all. And this is the case of the indigenous communities. So they are lacking and left behind of saying what is happening. And the second measure they took is just closing all the public places. And then the public places in the rural areas was the market only, because the market are not every day, but it is one time a week. And then it's moving from this village is today and another village is the next day. So then just they take the measure to close all the market, no one have the right to come. And then at the end of the day, the community get really confused because even if they get a fresh product, they cannot go to the market, exchange them. And then we use, like in my community, we are cattle herders. We have a milk. So we sell the milk and then the product of it, butter and whatever, and exchange it with the cereal. And then when you do not get to the market, you cannot buy the cereal. And it starts becoming a big issue. So then when there are cases, I mean, they do not understand what's happening, but there is no hospital at all. There was no hospital. So people cannot go for the normal sickness. So when they get contacted, it's completely another things. So the social impact will be becoming very huge at the communities. But let us come back to this one. We all know, we say like 2020 will be a super years of biodiversity, super years of climate change, and then super years on the SDGs. All we are going to combine and create a very transformative world for us based on a big decision and just solutions for the environment. So the super years for us is turn it over a drama and a nightmare over a night, because we cannot anymore move from one region to another one because the border was closed. So the impact on the environment become huge. Why? People do not have access to the clean water even to drink. I did that in many of my presentations. We depend from the river waters, from the lake waters, the same water that the cattle drinks. And as human beings, we drink it. When I go back home to my community, I visit them, I go and drink, personally that I'm talking to you, I go and drink the same water they are drinking from the river and from the lake, not because now I get access to this Zoom. So how those peoples can get access to the soap to wash them hand at least 4 or 5 times a day, just to do not contact the corona? It's impossible. If you cannot drink it, you cannot use it to wash your hand. The mask, when the corona started, the temperature was between 45 to 50 degrees Celsius. So just in the normal way, without anything, how are you going to breathe? You already like getting tired. And when you have to use the mask. And at the top, there is no access to those masks. But anyway, it's very dramatic. But what I did, I took my responsibility and then went to my communities. So we need to give them the right information by taking the measure. So we went to the communities, trying to inform them. We make a brochure to explain to them what is going on, what is this sickness, why, and how you can contact it, and creating the social distances, and trying to lock down our communities to say, refuse anyone from outside to get access to you. If you have to go out, you have to wear the mask. We give them certain kind of mask. You have to wear the mask. And we give them the soap that you have to wash your hand before to get in contact again with the community when you are back. And if anyone else come to the communities, make the social distance, ask him to wash his hand, to wear the mask, and talk to him from far. So we try to give the information to 16 communities, but we have so many communities, we couldn't reach out to all of them. Our final was just calling them by the phone and trying to explain to them the measure, but we couldn't give them all the support that they want. So they are left behind by the government measures, by the NGOs or big institutions measures that are giving the mask around all the big towns, or giving the soap, or giving the gel that you have to use to wash your hand. Indigenous communities do not have this privilege. And this is not only in Chad, but I'm thinking about my brothers and sisters in Amazon, where we have more than 20,000 that died, because just so they are getting vulnerable of this pandemic and they do not have any access to the hospitals. And I'm thinking from my brothers and sisters from the small islands, from the Pacific, where just the island are locked down and they cannot get access to anything. So it is really a big threat for all indigenous communities. And it is more threat for our environment that is getting fastened and destroyed. I'm ending by today news again. The world lost since 1970 to 1916. So it's less than 30 years, lost 68% of the mammals. 90% of them coming from Amazon, 70% from Africa. And we have the species who become endangered. And I believe that the species who is endangering the others are the human species. And if this human species do not recognize, respect indigenous peoples who are protecting the rest of the world without discrimination, that you are human, or you are animals, or you are mammals, or you are fish, we cannot get there. Indigenous peoples respect all the species. We respect at the same way we respect human beings, that we respect trees, we respect plants, we respect fish, we respect a little ant, insect, or mammals, or whatever. We respect them. We give them the life they deserve. The other human beings need to follow us and respect it in order to get out from COVID and the rest of the crisis.
Absolutely. And as you say, I think the timing of today's webinar could not be more apt, with the launch of WWF's report on warning of the catastrophic decline of wildlife. And I think you've really laid bare the challenge that the coronavirus pandemic poses to access to the most basic necessities, be it kind of drinkable water, masks, and even having a home and place to shelter. And I think you've also kind of helpfully segued into some of those solutions and the role that information and awareness campaigns can play in raising awareness of those issues. And I want to take a step back from just the coronavirus pandemic and looking at the broader challenges of how Indigenous people can protect their land, be it through legalizing their right to tenure, be it through kind of government policies. And David, I wanted to turn to you and ask whether in your research and the report you're working on at the moment, or even more broadly, you had seen any kind of stories of hope or hotspots where Indigenous communities had successfully managed to protect their land.
Well, there's lots of Indigenous and Afro-descendant territories around Latin America where they've been protecting their lands and their forests very effectively. In terms of the specific areas that we've been looking at in the research of things that can be done to support Indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant efforts and to collaborate and work with them, basically comes down to 5 major areas. The first area is everything that has to do with land rights and forest rights and strengthening those rights. Not only giving people title, but making sure that when they have title, that they're actually able to push out or keep from coming in groups that come from outside, or to keep petroleum companies or mining companies from having concessions that are on top of their area that have title. There's large areas of the Amazon, for example, where Indigenous territories have a mining concession on top of them or a petroleum concession. So strengthening title and territorial rights more generally is basic. Even in Latin America, which has gone farther than the other regions in guaranteeing Indigenous territorial rights, there's still about 1/3 of the forests that are managed by Indigenous peoples that don't have formal recognition. So that's a key issue. A second key issue is payment for environmental services. And I'd have to say that on that one, I've been kind of surprised by what we found in our research. I was a little bit skeptical about how well this would work. But Mexico, Ecuador, Peru, Guatemala have all had government programs to pay Indigenous communities or territories for their environmental services that are providing very important results, very positive results that need recognition and need more support than they're getting. A third area is community forest management and Indigenous management of their forests for to be able to sell products, to be able to live, to be able to manage the forest collectively as a way to extract forest products both for themselves and for other people. Here, what we find is that often the biggest difficulty is government policies that over-regulate Indigenous territories, that make it difficult for them to get permits, for them to get their forest management plans approved, where there's a tendency to think that if Indigenous peoples or Afro-descendant communities are logging or involved in extracting forest products, that somehow negative to the forest, when in fact those actions are fundamental for them to be able to sustain that forest over time and manage that forest over time. The fourth area, and for me this might have been the biggest surprise, is the importance of cultural revitalization and traditional knowledge. And I say the biggest surprise because almost none of these forest projects out there or forest programs out there have cultural components. They're not considered part of forest management, but cultural revitalization and traditional knowledge is closely linked to forest management. There's a good study in Bolivia. Carlos was talking about the Tacana people in Bolivia. There's a good study that shows that the Tacana villages that have more intact traditional knowledge manage their forests better than Tacana villages where that knowledge has been eroding over time. Brazil has had incredible experiences with fire management based on Indigenous fire management techniques that have been very successful in large areas of Indigenous and Afro-descendant Quilombola territories in Brazil. So cultural revitalization, traditional knowledge is important, and it's very important as well for social capital, for social cohesion, for building governance. And the last area, the fifth area, would be territorial governance. and support for territorial governance and support for the indigenous and Afro-descendant organizations that are fundamental to all these things that we're talking about. Fundamental, everything from managing their territories themselves to making their voices heard in the capitals and across the world, like Hindu has been doing so important work around the world in that regard, along with many of her indigenous brothers and sisters.
Thanks, David. Those are really useful points. And I note particularly in what you've said, the role of revitalization and local knowledge, and of course, how traditional skills and knowledge should be seen as a complement and indeed not a barrier to scientific knowledge and climate adaptation efforts. And Hindu and Carlos, I know you touched on a couple of those points as well. Could you elaborate a bit on how a local and traditional knowledge can help improve food security in particular and crop diversity?
Yeah. Yes, well, I go ahead first. So even indigenous peoples are frontline of many other crises that's caused by human beings. Indigenous peoples still have a lot of knowledge, a lot of traditional knowledge and ecological knowledge that help us to survive and help us to share this information with many other peoples that producing the food. So in terms of the food system, they are okay, Carlos. So in terms of food system, there are a lot of knowledge to help to produce it. And even the seeds, the indigenous seeds coming from different indigenous communities around the world are very diverse, and that one create a food sovereignty. And when I say food sovereignty, during COVID, we all saw that the entire world agree on one thing, closing the frontiers, but opening the frontier for the food shipping, because they realize that they are not autosufficient, they are dependent from each other. So they agree that even plane or boat or whatever car or whatever system of transport can transport the food shipping. So for indigenous communities, where we always depend from the food we produce, so we do have the knowledge who help us to maintain our food system, who help us to understand the season and then plant the crops. I give you the example of my communities, and I know many other communities around the world are also doing them on knowledge. So when communities wanted to plant a crops, they can just look at the seasons from the astrological knowledge. We look through the star. I give you the example, we know there are millions of the stars in the sky, but we follow only 24 of them. And from the 24 of them, 23 are go and end on 13 days. One of them only end on 14 days. And when you make the total of all the days of each star that coming, it gives you the 360. That's mean the year. So we don't need the calendars to look at it, but we look at those stars very early morning or just early on the afternoon. It depends from where they're coming. So we do not just watch them just for our knowledge system because we like the sky or because astrological knowledge, but we look at them because that helps us to plant the crops in the right way. Even if there is no rain, the time arrives, they say if you plant the first your crops, that means you will get more harvest product than when you wait until next week before to do it. So those are unique knowledge, unique traditional knowledge related to the food and security. So if you delay it, you delay your agriculture. It is the same time for our cattle. So as we are nomadic, some of us live around Lake Chad, where is the wetland. And during the rain season, you cannot stay around the lake because the water will flow. So you need to go far away to 300 to 500 kilometers or 1,000 from the lake. And the dry season, you come around the lake because you can get the wetland and the pastures. But when you leave, you do not just decide, you say, okay, today is 2nd of December, we leave. It's not like that. We use it from our own calendars when our cattle start lying down and facing them head east or west or north or south. They do not do that. They are not just like, yes, they are animals, they can come and lie down everywhere. It's completely wrong. They know exactly what they are doing. When the rain season is coming, we have to leave the lake, they lie down, they face them head to the south, and they have them head up with the nose that is smiling and checking the head. So we know exactly that the rain season is coming. We cannot stay there to get flood, but we have to move. So we follow them. And then that's how we survive to get our food. There are a lot of examples that can help communities to get the food if we apply. But the problem is with the pandemic, with the climate change, with all, it cannot allow us to apply our knowledge in the proper way. And when we do not have also the land rights, we cannot decide for our land. They grab the land. There is no land tenures because our knowledge as are ecosystemic based. They are based on our land territories and resources. And when those land territories and resources are grabbed from us, so we cannot anymore produce the real knowledge. Even we do have those knowledges, we cannot apply them. And that's why we end up with the food insecurity. And then we are so sad because we know the solution who can help us to get out from it, but we do not have any tools to apply it because we are locked down by our land grabbing from big companies or government or whatever individual person who have more power than us.
I think that's an excellent point, Hindu, and how, as you say, all the kind of local and traditional knowledge in the world will be of very little use if you don't have the ability to freely manage those resources. But I think you've also given a brilliant example of how Indigenous communities can make extremely useful and constructive observations on, be it climate forecasting or agricultural development. And this reminds me of something, Carlos, you were saying the other day to me, which was that Indigenous people have been using sustainable resources for hundreds of years, but yet in the world, we're reducing our crop diversity every year. Can you elaborate on that contradiction a little bit, Carlos?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It's extremely interesting and very insightful to hear this. From the local knowledge, it's extremely valuable for all of us. Yeah, so it's been amazing how much we as a humanity, we've been reducing our diversity of crops, like the food that we used to eat. So, and it's not that long ago in Bolivia, I used to have other types of food that now it's more difficult to get because they don't have, like you cannot sell this in big amounts, like the quantity, it's not profitable anymore. So there are a few things that are not available now. Or if they're available, you don't know how to cook those, and that information, that knowledge is getting lost. So there's, like as I mentioned before, it's a few crops that there are like 10 crops that humanity pretty much depends on for everything: rice, wheat, corn. It's amazing. The U.S., like the center of the U.S., is just like a big corn plantation, and you have potatoes all over the place, and there's one or two types of potatoes, whereas in Peru, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, the center of origin of potatoes, like hundreds of varieties of potato. So when I was growing up in Bolivia, I used to have one type of potato for every single different type of dish that we have. So red potatoes and here this type or the other way, or like different ways to prepare, dehydrated potatoes, black and white. So there's so many different types of cook or prepared potatoes that we are going to lose that variety of food because we are so concentrated on massive quantity production for profitable reasons. Whereas in indigenous communities in general, and it's related to what Hindu was saying about the seasonality, the changes in season. So you have some crops, some things that you can harvest, you can hunt in specific parts or times of the year. You cannot do this in some part of the year, or you don't plant, or you don't harvest things from this part of the forest in this part of the year. So that is extremely valuable. And the indigenous people preserve that knowledge as long as they have the land right, the land tenure. And an example of that from Bolivia, there's an indigenous community called Ceja, that they used to be mobile. They used to move along in the past. They had, like big areas. They were foraging a community. They used to move, and then they didn't have this idea of private or property land. So for them, the landscape were their land. So they moved with the season for hunting, for harvesting. But many years ago, there's like the government decided to give land rights, land properties. So this community was forced to live in one area. So they have this land. They live there, and then and at that time the government gave this community, resources, chickens, some seeds, and everything. But the community didn't have the cultural knowledge to manage those resources. So they ate all the chickens, they ate all the seeds, because that's what they do. That's what they were, they move along the landscape, eat the resources, and move to the next place. But now they were forced to live in these areas. So there were all other issues. And then the information, the genetic information the variety of food that this indigenous community was consuming is lost now. They are not moving in the landscape anymore. They're just static in one area. So that is one of the dangers. In the future, when climate change, we're going to get extreme events. We're going to get massive floods. We're going to get hurricanes. Everything is changing in terms of climate. And there are things like extreme droughts, for example. Those potato plantations or corn plantations or wheat plantations are going to suffer from those, and we're going to be getting less production of those. And then we will start looking back, what were we able to eat, or what indigenous communities can produce or can eat, and then supplement our diet. On the other hand, we as a humanity have a big problem in nutrition. It's not just malnutrition, it's also obesity, and that's related to the diversity of foods and the way that we process food in general. So by incorporating a variety of like a more balanced diet in our lives, then those problems will get reduced as well. So it's all the different ways to think about how these indigenous people can help us to save our lives.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carlos. And I actually see we have an absolute flurry of questions coming in from the audience. So I'm going to move to those without further ado. And I apologize in advance if we don't get through all of them. I'll try to combine them as much as possible. The first two I'm going to combine are one that asks whether there's any evidence to show that restoration efforts globally are paying attention to the losses, including cultural losses, that indigenous peoples suffer with the loss of forests. And someone tied to this question, another one asking how much more can be done to better educate the general population, especially when it comes to the full scope of impact as a result of deforestation, but also to what extent does a degree of lack of understanding of indigenous populations or even racism, to what extent does that kind of affect government perspectives when it comes to protecting and safeguarding those lands? Whoever would like to go first. So kind of summarizing, I would say, are we starting to see a shift in understanding from global restoration efforts, and what more could be done to educate the general population?
So I will jump in. It's very technical questions, but however, I can say that international level setup some process or some platform that's supposed to help the restorations of the lands that degraded, or stop deforestations, or restore the biodiversity, or respect the indigenous people's rights and land, even it's not implementing as we want. I'm referring to the 3 Rio Conventions, the UN Convention on Climate Change, on biodiversity, on desertifications. Those 3 conventions supposed to be the main one who help the world to understand the loss of biodiversity, the crisis of climate change, and also the desertification advance that are degrading our land. And it's supposed also to take the global leadership of the world to decide and reduce all the emissions. And luckily we get, yes, the Paris agreements, but it took more than 20 years before we come to the Paris agreement that recognize, yes, human rights and indigenous people rights are very critical, and they more recognize the indigenous people's knowledge that they put in a specific article, Article 7.5 on the adaptation. That for us as indigenous, we say like, it's very easy to take our positive part, but forget our negative part for them, because our rights are all mixed in the preambles of the decisions and preambles of the agreement. So through this one, they are also the good face maybe, but for us, it is not enough. That cannot help to respect our right or restore it. So the creation of the facilitative, the local communities and indigenous peoples platform, where there will be an exchange of the knowledge, a policy a draft of the knowledge, and capacity building, that was like the first step. It was good. So it's a start, because we say you cannot talk about us and without us. So that's happening. That's why we get the decision on creation of the facilitative working group, who is the body under the the climate change conventions that help indigenous peoples to be 7 representatives, and also 7 representatives from the government, not more, in the equitable way, where we can decide on how our knowledge can be helpful, can be useful. So this is one of the steps. And the second step also, it took too long. Last year, it was in August, when the IPCC, the expert group that written the report on the climate change.
The
on
role of
land.
indigenous knowledge, yeah.
So in the land, it was the first time also they recognized that indigenous people's knowledge can help to restore the land. So it is also just a report. And when you come to the biodiversity, we did have like the Article 8G, who was going to be revised, and 10 on traditional knowledge, and 10C on the participation, that also going to get revised. And when you come to the desertifications, there was from the beginning, of course, like gender and communities, but it's a little bit mixed. So you do not see clearly the indigenous peoples there. So all those frameworks supposed to be a guardian for indigenous peoples, supposed to be a guardian of protection our nature, restoring it. But however, that taken at the international level. The most important part is the implementation at the national level and at the local level. So those decisions are not well transcribed or transferred to the national law. That's where we have a big lack of recognition of indigenous peoples as peoples, of recognition of the indigenous people's land are very particular, and then the governance need to be left in the indigenous people's hand without interference of any local authorities or any national governments. So there are lack of this one. That's why we are facing these big problems. But I can say we still have time to catch up on it if we want. When we have the example of COVID-19 come over the night, all the world come change radically. So it's mean we are capable as government or private sectors or indigenous community, as human beings, we are really capable to change radically overnight. so we still can catch up and respect the rights of indigenous peoples, recognizing it, restore the land, but we don't have time. We say we have only time 10 years to the Paris Agreement's objective, but let me tell you, we already reached the Paris Agreement objective in Chad. Since 1999 to now, we have already 1.5 degrees. In Arctic, 2 degrees. So the Paris objective was 1 degree on maximum 2. So we already reached it. So if we wait for the next 10 years, it's going to be beyond. Actually, now when I'm talking to you, we are facing a big flood in all the Sahel regions. If you watch, you can go to my Twitter and see it if you want the evidence of the videos, or through all the Google, you can Google it. In Niger, in Chad, I mean, you have to move with the canoe in the city. With the canoe in the city, who's supposed to be car and motorbike and whatever. And all the road was break down. You cannot get from one region to another one, from one country to another one because of the flood that break all down. So we are living the extreme weather events, from the 50 degrees Celsius to the continuous floods and ending by the food insecurity. So we need to act right now and respect the rights of indigenous peoples. Give us back the leadership, and we know how to protect and how to manage the ecosystem. If our rights do not respect, I think we are all in the bad pathway of our future.
I think what you say is really interesting on, you know, the urgency of the coronavirus pandemic, leaving governments really and communities more broadly with no excuse anymore to say that they can ignore the situation. And I've seen that parallel made, for example, with homelessness in many countries where governments that previously said, you know, we're cash strapped, we just don't have the kind of budget or the time to address these issues. Well, now many governments have shown that in record amounts of time, they can address those issues. So I think that's an interesting point. And also what you mentioned on the distinction between international frameworks and how they translate and get implemented at the local level. I want to come to one question that's directed particularly for David. This person asked, at the end of your presentation, David, you mentioned the worsening situation of indigenous territories in Latin America. From your research, what issues primarily do indigenous people need to fight for? This person says, I assume it must be tenure rights. Are there any other issues that require particular attention?
Well, as I mentioned, tenure rights is not just a question of titling. The question of concessions that are on top of indigenous lands that may even have title is a big issue in Latin America. Mining concessions, petroleum concessions, forestry concessions. The issue of protected areas being put on indigenous territories without the consent, the full, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples about those protected areas and how those protected areas are going to operate is another important part of what indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant communities in Latin America have been fighting for. I think that one thing that's important to say, going back to the previous questions, is related to the question of racism. Racism is very much at the heart of so much of this. And I think the best example of that is understanding property rights in Latin America. Governments give indigenous peoples or Afro-descendant communities a title, and then those communities are illegally invaded. And it's really often left to the communities themselves to resolve the problem or to get rid of those people or to find a solution to the problem. If the land that was invaded was by a rich latifundista, by a rich large landowner, by a rich cattle rancher, the government would have troops in there within days, and those people would be violently removed. But in the Latin American case, when it's indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant communities, it's the people being killed are not the illegal invaders, it's the illegal invaders who are killing the local population.
That's a really good point, David. That reminds me of one of our producers at TRF, Max, was traveling with our reporter Carla last year in in the Brazilian Amazon, reporting on the guardians of forests, so the kind of tribes fighting against illegal logging. And really sadly, one of the indigenous leaders whom we'd profiled in our video, Paulino Limpio Guajajara, was killed just a few months after the video by some illegal loggers. And so very often, as you say, I think these people have to pay at the cost of their own lives to defend their lands. And we certainly see, I think, in terms of reaction from governments, a kind of double measure, if you will, or two-tiered kind of system of responses depending on whom it's set to benefit. Kind of slightly following on from this question, actually, one that I think is really interesting and that we haven't addressed as much. This person is asking, if we accept language diversity as a measure of human cultural diversity, it's clear that cultures are more at risk of extinction than biological species, with 50% of the world's languages being endangered. So we need to work to conserve biological as well as cultural diversity in languages. How do the panelists suggest we work effectively at both ends of this extinction crisis? Would anyone like to take that one first?
I'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
Indigenous people land can definitely help in both ends. We will be able to preserve local knowledge, including languages. But also within this land, there is a lot of information recently, but there is a lot of evidence published recently that it's helping to reduce the biodiversity crisis. It's reducing the extinction of, not reducing the extinction, more than it's helping to protect species that are endangered elsewhere. So by having these areas and protecting land, indigenous land, we will be able to also protect species, but also importantly manage those species. Remember, this is that indigenous people have been doing for a long time. It's been using the resources in a sustainable manner. So we will be able to reduce the biodiversity loss, but also preserve languages. Now, how we can improve that, or how can we will be able to reduce, or we will be able to mitigate that problem, but how can we reverse that trend? That, I think, it is one of the biggest challenges. Once that a language is lost, or once a species goes to extinction, pretty much that's the end of the story, right? And so how we can reverse that? So we need to be aware of those issues. We need to be aware that once the language is lost, once we lost one species, is gone forever. And there's no way that we will be able to bring those back. So it's in our hands to preserve those, and then they help the people, the guardians of the forest, to protect that knowledge and protect the species.
Thank you.
I wanted to add on this language and culture. So we also know that 2019 was the International Year of Indigenous Languages. So that's also one of the safeguarding the languages, who can safeguard the cultures. And also our traditional knowledge, and especially when I talk from my communities, our knowledge are also language-based, ecosystemic-based, but language-based. The things that we can say and protect or know with our mother tongue, I can't translate it within French, English, Arabic, or whatever major languages. It's only in my mother tongue. And many of the species of the nature also have the names, not like the scientific names, because there are so millions, but we do have the names in our mother tongues. So if the language is extinct, it is also the culture, the identity, the biological diversity who can be extinct. So protecting the language of indigenous peoples is also protecting the knowledge and the ecosystem. So the years of indigenous people languages might be one of the reference we can use with all the recommendation and try again to fight to preserve those languages.
Thank you, Hindu. That's a really good point. I want to bring one other question. In fact, several people seem to have asked this question. We only have time probably for one or two more, but I want to raise this one because it's not an issue we've also really discussed yet. The question is, to what degree, if any, has technology been incorporated in process, particularly as a real-time tool or resource to educate and raise awareness around these issues of deforestation and land degradation? And are there any challenges or successes we can point to yet in terms of using those technologies? Would anyone like to go first?
I can make a quick comment on that. I was reading a report about the use of cell phones in the world, and a report in Bolivia said that in average people had 2 cell phones. And that's a technology that is getting cheaper and cheaper, and the access is very accessible. And there's been some attempts to inform people in especially, I believe it was in Africa. There was a report in Africa to share some information about outbreaks or pandemics using cell phone. So everybody's pretty much connected. The problem is that in this case is the access to internet is not cheap. So if you are you can have the cell phone, but you're going to save your credit, your funds to make important calls or to to communicate with your relatives, not to follow up news because it's not accessible. So once the internet becomes cheaper and more globalized, I think it will be an excellent tool. But meanwhile, it's going to be still, it is a privilege to have access to internet in many places.
Thanks, Carlos. And David and Hindu, on your end, any kind of examples you've seen of technology being used for good or bad in protecting indigenous land?
Well, there's certainly in Latin America very rapidly increasing use of drones by the indigenous communities to monitor their forests and to check for illegal loggers and illegal invaders. Just another thing to note is, although it's not new technology, it's incredibly important technology, particularly for the language issue, is that community radios in traditional languages are very important as a way to communicate across the territories and also as a way to maintain governance and social cohesion.
Mm. That's a good point, and certainly it's one we've seen in our reporting as well. Hindu.
So to add on what the colleague said, I share with you the example that I use technology to monitor and protect the natural resources. You say that in my bio earlier, using the 3D participatory mapping. So we are using the 2D or 3D participatory mapping with the GPS who can map the a specific point, and then we put the traditional knowledge and the science knowledge together. That's help to better give the information on resilience and adaptation to the communities. So it also helped the land management system. When I use the 3D participatory mapping in Chad, that was taken very positively by the government as examples to reopen 60,000 kilometers of the corridors, just by seeing the example of the technology we use with traditional knowledge. And it's helped also to see how we can do a land tenure system in the traditional way around using the technology and the traditional knowledge. And I'm also totally agree that cell phones are very important for the communities to see how they can get more information. That's what we use to call the communities and tell them about the pandemic and how it's going, because if we couldn't get to them, so we can call at least 1 or 2 of them who get access to the internet and tell them. And if you don't have like the 3D mapping, you cannot do it because some of the places are very in risk for the accessibility. And as you know, Sahel regions are locked down between climate change and the terrorists or whatever. So you can do the mapping through the by using the software And then you can go through the software and do the mapping and make the map available for the communities. It's helped to limit the conflict between the communities. So I do not see like the conflict between traditional knowledge and the science knowledge, but they are all complementary to give us the better and faster solutions to protect our rights, our knowledge, but to promote also what we are doing as solutions.
And then I think this is probably going to be our final question, but it's somewhat related to what we've just been discussing, and I think particularly relevant during the coronavirus pandemic. This person asks, are the panelists seeing problems with misinformation arriving in communities? In some communities with which we work, so much false information is arriving via social media, leading communities to think the virus, for example, is made up by the government. And linked to this, have the panelists seen many instances of young Indigenous people that have migrated to cities, returning to the community during the crisis, and has this had positive effects? So a two-pronged question, one on whether you're seeing any misinformation, and two, whether we're seeing some kind of reverse migration of people coming back from cities to their original communities.
I'd like to comment on the first one. I think this pandemic has been misused by many governments, and like there's misinformation around that, and when not just government but many actors in politics, from conspiracy theories that some government is creating the virus to someone in, for example, in Bolivia, some characters saying that this is a production of the U.S. to oppress the people. So there is a lot of misinformation about that, and that misinformation it's amplified by social media. So and in that sense, one of the things that I'm seeing is that all these we need the lack of critical thinking in our general population, everyone in the population. People are not thinking, they are just believing whatever it's in Facebook, whatever it's in Twitter, without asking questions. And for that, I blame myself, I blame scientists that are working on these issues. We are mostly focusing on producing scientific documents, technical documents. We are just siloed and then discussing that with other scientists, and we fail to communicate our findings to the rest of the population or to the rest of the world in a manner that is digestible, that they can understand, and communicating our science. That was, I think, I strongly believe that our big mistake. It was not communicate our science to the general public, and it's our responsibility to do that. So that way people can question those misinformation, can ask the right questions, saying like, hey, no, doesn't seem true or doesn't make sense. So, but this COVID-19 pandemic has exposed all these issues that we have as a society, and that's one of the things I'm really committed to now. It's to talk more about these issues and then share the work, the science that we are doing, and work with local communities, with the general public to address these problems. We are as scientists owe this to the people, to society. And I think that it's and that's my comment on the first question. On the second, I have no comment.
Thank you, Carlos. And David or Hindu, I wonder if we have any final fleeting thoughts you wanted to make on either of those questions, and if not, I'll probably wrap up our discussion.
Well, there are a lot of young people who are returning to their communities, often not by choice, but because they have no other option. And it is a complicated situation because of that.
Absolutely, I think that's true of many regions around the world.
Just quickly, for the fake news, I mean, it's depend from those who get access to the internet and who understand the language that they're sending with it. So I'm not too worried about it for the communities who do not have access to the electricity anymore. But for the living back to the communities, I mean, not to the indigenous communities maybe, but I'm seeing people going back a lot to the rural areas. And I think that also another way maybe in the near future to see the grabbing of the land who can become maybe much, much bigger. Because people are very scared also to be locked down in the cities. And I'm seeing that also in the big cities like Paris or New York. So people are all going to live outside of the big city because they, when they lock down, they don't have even a balcony to go out. They are just locked in the apartment. They wanted to see outside, they can. So they are going to be a caution of migrations from the big cities to the rural areas. But just quickly, I didn't touch in a cautions of the indigenous women's impacted by the environment or impacted by the COVID. So in one sentence, indigenous, I mean, not indigenous, only women in general and girls are impacted in COVID separately, because the girls who do not go into schools found themselves very, I mean, so many pregnancy. So they are high, like plus rate of pregnancy of young girls in the cities, in other communities, because they cannot go to the school. And from the environmental issues, they are frontline of the climate change, of the biodiversity. They are really like not taking the decision. They are out of the decision making, but they are the most impacted. And just like to come to this anonymous as a spectator in the cautions, philanthropic and all people can help. So they can help by putting a direct access funding to the indigenous organizations, indigenous women organization, funding them activities, funding them to have a revenue, to create an adaptation system, and then to give them more capacity. I mean, when they have financial capacity, they must get like a decision capacity with the communities where can decide in all. Thank you so much for allowing me touching in this gender issue.
No, I'm so glad you mentioned it, Hindu. And I think, as you say, I mean, sadly, that disproportionate impact of the pandemic plays out not just on Indigenous communities, but as you say, on women and girls as well. And I think we've covered a lot of ground here, from misinformation to cultural and biological diversity, forests, mitigating climate change, technology. I'm sure we could go on for hours, but I'm conscious of our panelists and our audience's time. Thank you so very much to the three of you for joining and for all of the excellent points. A huge thank you to the organizers for putting together such a brilliant panel, but also with such a high number of registrations. And finally, thank you very much to you, our audience, for joining and for your patience. I'm very sorry if we haven't had a chance to address your question, but please do feel free to get in touch on Twitter with either of us or with the Land Portal team. And of course, a video of the whole discussion will be emailed to you just after this, so you can refer back to it. And we'd also be very grateful if you could just take the survey in a couple of minutes to say what you thought of the discussion. And finally, the series will be back next week for its concluding webinar, this one on how throughout the pandemic, environmental protections have diminished or disappeared altogether, leaving the door wide open for abuse, corruption, and land grabs. And what role Indigenous communities can play in mitigating those risks. In the meantime, I wish you all a very pleasant week, and I hope you and your loved ones stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Zoe. Thanks, everyone. Bye.